Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on FSC's Policy of Association Remediation Framework. We've been very excited to present for you today. With me on this call, I have Anna Jenkins and Salem Jones and Amparo. And I am Laura Worm. I'm your moderator for today. And Amparo, if you could shift the slide. Good, thank you. So today, the objective of the meeting is to share the high-level information on what the framework is and what the next steps are. But it's also really important for us to get feedback from you guys. So this is an opportunity to help us get feedback along the way. Everything today will be simultaneously translated. So you do have the option of picking the language that you choose. We will have two different channels. One is English and one is in Bahasa Indonesian. We are also recording this call and we will be sharing the recording with you afterwards. If you do not like to be visible in the recording, it's completely fine if you turn off your camera. Otherwise, we do encourage you to have your camera on so that we can see each other during the discussion. Can we have the next slide? Good. So we have a few housekeeping rules. If you'd like to speak or if you'd like to comment along the way, please do raise your hand. We have 3 different presentations for you today. During those presentations, we will have Q&A sessions after each of them. We do ask you that when you ask directly after a presentation, that you keep your questions to the content of that particular presentation. We will have an open Q&A on the framework as such and on the process as such at the end of the session, where we will have plenty of time to discuss. If you don't feel comfortable in raising your hand and speaking out loud, that's also okay. You are free to submit your questions in the chat, and you can just do that along the way. I will keep monitoring that chat. If you don't feel comfortable asking the question out in public, you are also welcome to just send a message directly to me in the chat box, and I won't reveal who sent that question. It will be anonymous. If you don't know how to do that, in the chat, you will see a button that says to, and then right now it would say everyone. If you click on the arrow down, you are able to choose me. The person called Loa Dalga Worm, FSC International. And if you choose me, you can send the message directly only to me. If you send questions in advance, I will pick them up in the Q&A sessions, and we will address them in prioritized and grouped order. Good. The agenda today. We will start out by looking at what is the FSC Policy of Association Remediation Framework. Then we will look into what type of requirements are actually included. And then we will have a short session on what are the next steps in this process. We have key takeaway messages just to sum everything up. Then we have a Q&A session. That Q&A session will begin with me trying to ask, especially Salem, all of the hard questions that I could think of, so that we try and tackle some of those up front. And then we will open the floor for all of the questions that you will have. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Salem.
Great, thanks, Loa. I'm looking forward to those difficult questions that you've been working on. Welcome to the webinar on the Policy for Association Remediation Framework. We're very happy to be presenting this material to you. This is 4 years in the making, and many of you, many of you will know this work and will have been part of the genesis of making this work happen and bringing this out to public consultation. So we're very happy to be having this webinar with you today. My name is Salem Jones. I am the program manager for the dispute resolution program at FSC International. I work on the policy for association complaints processing and ending disassociation processes at FSC International. Next slide, please. I would like to briefly just present to you what the Policy for Association Remediation Framework is, and also to explain what it is not. The Policy for Association Framework used to be known as the generic roadmap. Some of you might be familiar with that terminology. The generic roadmap rose out of the Asia Pulp and Paper roadmap process to create a generic template for ending disassociation cases. The Policy for Association Remediation Framework takes an even larger footprint within the FSC normative framework. The remediation framework is now working in tandem with the conversion remedy procedure, which we will also cover in this session. The remediation framework lays out the requirements, indicators, thresholds, timelines, and guidance set by FSC, established by FSC, and ultimately to be approved by the FSC International Board for managing all ending disassociation processes, as well as pre-association or pre-certification remedy processes for violations of the Policy for Association unacceptable activities. Excuse me. What I would like to explain is what this remediation framework is not. This remediation framework is not any company-specific roadmap, meaning that this remediation framework would not be taken by a company and just be implemented, and then that would count as a company-specific remediation process. But rather, this remediation framework will be adapted on a case-by-case basis to any pre-association, pre-certification organizations seeking to remedy specific Policy for Association violations, or again, for ending disassociation cases, this template or this remediation framework would be used on a case-by-case basis to be adapted to the specific Policy for Association violations for those companies seeking to end disassociation with FSC. The PFA remediation framework also stipulates certain infrastructure pieces or operational procedures in which FSC is responsible for. This would be the verification of milestones, as well as the platform for publishing or reporting demonstration of progress of those milestones by organizations working their way through their company-specific roadmap. Next slide, please. You might be asking yourself how we entered this journey as FSC, how this journey started. Some of you will know that the Policy for Association, as it was published in version 2 in 2009, and as the previous Policy for Association complaints processing procedure, neither of those documents anticipated an ending disassociation process or ending disassociation conditions, but rather that policy and procedure laid out the process for processing a Policy for Association complaint and ultimately coming to a decision to end our relationship as FSC with that organization, with that company group. But there wasn't any discussion around how we would ever get back together, how the company could ever reassociate or attain FSC certification again in the future. And so this work was really articulated by the FSC International Board and Board Meeting 72. This board meeting laid out the high-level requirements or high-level conditions in which any remedy process would have to adhere to. First and foremost, that process should not be arbitrary. It should not contain arbitrary thresholds that would not be comparable or fair to apply across the board to ending disassociation cases. The conditions should follow clear and predictable rules. There should be a transparent process. Organizations should understand what they're getting into, what those conditions would be, and be able to understand also internally what it would take for them to put that in place. Ultimately, the conditions need to be outcome-oriented. It needs to lead to a changed management approach, and that change needs to be demonstrable and measurable. Ultimately, we're seeking to remediate social and environmental harm stemming from policy for association violations. And these conditions should bring that change. There should be credible involvement of stakeholders and a transparent process for involving those stakeholders. And we should make sure that there's a prevention of future policy for association violations through a transformative process that actually changes operations and quality management systems to prevent the reoccurrence of PFA violations. And ultimately, all of this should be independently verified according to FSC's principles, or FSC's third-party certification system. Next slide, please. What are we trying to attain with the PFA remediation framework? First and foremost, we are looking to create a process in which policy for association violations could be acknowledged, addressed, and ultimately rectified. Those policy for association violations are the 6 that you see on your screen: significant conversion in forestry operations, destruction of high conservation values, excuse me, in forestry operations, illegal logging and trade in illegal forest products, violation of traditional and human rights in forestry operations, violation of ILO core conventions, and finally, use of GMO in forestry operations. I would like to explain that use of GMO in forestry operations is a light gray color because although it is our intention to create requirements and indicators for a remediation process for use of GMO, we've never had as FSC a policy for association violation case involving use of GMO in forestry operations. And so this is actually new work, breaking new ground, creating requirements and indicators that we've never actually applied in a policy for association case before. So this is actually work in progress, and we have a lot to learn from the forest dialogues in this respect. So you will not find that actually in the document. Ultimately, an objective of this framework is to rebuild trust with FSC and also with the market and with rights holders and stakeholders that have been affected by the policy for association violations. Again, to prevent the reoccurrence of any further violations, to allow access to remedy according to the UN guiding principles for business and human rights, for rights holders impacted by policy for association violations, and to ultimately obtain remedy agreements for those rights holders in order to come to some process understanding of what remediation would look like and how to measure whether that remediation has been obtained. And finally, the restoration and conservation of forest environmental values, which have been damaged or lost due to the policy for association violations. You might be thinking, how is this all connected to the FSC Global Strategic Plan? And where does this sit within the FSC corpus of work? The Global Strategic Plan talks about ultimately the creation of resilient forests for sustaining life on Earth. And the remediation framework is not only looking at the creation of resilient forests, but also the creation of resilient forest communities. So when we look at the co-creation indicators in the Global Strategic Plan, we also use those to talk about the creation of resilient communities and the resilience of forest communities that have been impacted by policy for association violations. I would like to go and explain to you how this is connected to the Global Strategic Plan in more detail. Next slide, please. Ultimately, our Global Strategic Plan goals around co-creation and the implementation of forest solutions is very much embedded in the thinking, in the in the spirit of this Policy for Association Remediation Framework. You will see echoes of restorative justice principles, restorative practice principles in resolution of conflict. You also see there's a governance body which is overseeing, the management of the remediation plan, what we call the company-specific roadmap, which is made up of rights holders, stakeholders, experts, peers, and company representatives. And it's through this intertwined, interconnected, and multidisciplinary approach that we see the co-creation of useful, implementable, feasible, and outcome-oriented solutions in order to drive remedy in organizations, in communities, in forests, and ultimately to restore those social and environmental values. You will also see the transformation of markets is well connected or well represented in the remediation framework through trust building measures, through the introduction of quality management systems and a robust level of verification of quality management systems, and also the achievement of milestones that allows for trust to be rebuilt in the market and also between FSC and the organization. And ultimately, the catalyzing of change through the transformative process of the remediation framework. Ultimately, we're seeking to transform organizations to prevent unacceptable activities in the future, and to see that organizations are operationalizing free, prior, informed consent and the grievance mechanisms according to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And again, the verification and reporting through the Demonstration of Progress website. Next slide, please. The Policy for Association Remediation Framework is also not only well grounded in the Global Strategic Plan, but it's also interconnected and well grounded in this discussion within FSC around conversion and the unacceptable activity of conversion. For this reason, we are currently working on 4 different pieces that are interconnected or interrelated around the concept of conversion. These 4 interconnected pieces come together at the point of conversion, but are also distinct in the sense that we are currently working on the policy on conversion that will soon be going through a name change, but that policy on conversion articulates a conversion remedy procedure, and the policy for association, which in turn is articulating the policy for association remediation framework to each address violations of those policies. Next slide, please. As we have these interconnected policy infrastructures, we are also, with intention, going to public consultation and seeking feedback from our members and stakeholders around these policy areas. We are currently undergoing public consultation on 3 of these 4 document frameworks. Those would be the conversion remedy procedure, the FSC policy for association, and the policy for association remediation framework. And we are seeking to present all of this information to our members and our stakeholders in an open, transparent way, and also so that this information can be compared across the public consultation platform so that stakeholders have a good idea of what our thinking is, the direction we're moving in, and also that they're able to understand fully the picture before commenting on any one of these documents. Next slide, please. Now that I've gone through kind of the interconnectedness of the PFA remediation framework within the FSC larger framework, its connection to the Global Strategic Plan, and also its connection inside of the FSC normative framework through the policy and conversion and also the policy for association, I would like to concentrate a bit on the overview of the policy for association remediation framework itself. This framework is largely built around a process principle in which there would be several stops along a line or several checkpoints in which FSC would be responsible for taking an important decision before the process can continue. You will see in this slide that there are prerequisites that you see on the left, prerequisites that every organization would be responsible for fulfilling before they could start a company-specific roadmap process. That company-specific roadmap process, as I mentioned earlier, is not the Policy for Association Remediation Framework, but rather a case-by-case adaptation of that framework according to the Policy for Association issues that need to be addressed within that specific organization. At point number 1, after the prerequisites have been received, have been verified, we would then move into the drafting of that organization-specific roadmap. That specific roadmap would go through public consultation, would go through a revision process, and ultimately be approved by the FSC International Board of Directors. We would then move into the implementation phase. This is phase number 2. This implementation phase is met by several verification of thresholds and milestones which are achieved along the way, which are spelled out in the company-specific roadmap. And ultimately, to reach the phase 3, restorative actions. Restorative actions are really those demonstrated agreements, those demonstrated processes which have been peer-reviewed, which have been reviewed by the governance remediation body, by rights holders and stakeholders to assess their robustness, to actually drive remedy for environmental and social harm. Once a certain number of those have been achieved and demonstrated and verified, we would then move into number 4, which would be the verification for ending disassociation. This would be the point in time where FSC would take a decision as to whether those thresholds in that company-specific roadmap have been achieved to a level that FSC is satisfied that it can now end the disassociation with the company. The thresholds have been met, the milestones have been achieved, verification has been successful, and now we're able to end the disassociation. And the company at that point could undergo, if it chooses, undergo an FSC certification process in parallel to completion of the remediation framework process. Ultimately, the concept within the remediation framework is to develop the process to ensure verification of an outcome-oriented delivery of those milestones, but without specifying or without prescribing exactly how the organization or how the company is to achieve those milestones. That's actually done through stakeholder processes. Next slide, please. What you will also see is that the policy for association plays a very strong role in defining the scope of the PFA remediation framework. As such, the company group as defined under the policy for association is the scope of application of the remediation framework for pre-association, pre-certification remedy processes. That scope is different for organizations that are undergoing an ending disassociation process. The thinking or the intention behind this is that in a pre-association, pre-certification process, the organization is disclosing policy for association issues that need to be remedied before entering the FSC system. In an ending disassociation process, the organization has been part of FSC, has been associated with FSC. FSC has invested in an investigation of policy for association issues with that company. FSC's reputation has been intertwined in these policy for association issues, and ultimately FSC has taken a decision to disassociate with a company. And for this reason, FSC needs further assurances, further trust building exercises to welcome that company or that organization back into the FSC system. And for that reason, the scope of the remediation framework includes also the company's supply chain. So what you see on the right is a demonstration of the company group plus the wood and wood fiber supply chain as encompassing that remediation framework scope. Next slide. As I mentioned in my introduction, the PFA remediation framework is very much connected to and bound to the policy for association, but it's not unrelated to the conversion remedy procedure and the policy on conversion through the unacceptable activity of significant conversion in the policy for association. And through this connection, we've also articulated touching points between the conversion remedy procedure and the policy for association remediation framework. And what we demonstrate here is what this touching point looks like in a pre-association, pre-certification scenario. The blue boxes signify the conversion remedy procedure at the top for addressing a legacy of conversion since 1994, and the remedy of that conversion through the conversion remedy procedure. That's the blue circle at the top of this image. The dark blue box indicates the disclosure or discovery of additional policy for association violations, which would then need to be remedied. That remedy process would then bring the organization to the policy for association remediation framework. And that's the orange circle at the bottom. And you would have a hybrid process for organizations addressing pre-association, pre-certification, both issues of conversion and also other policy for association violations. So that's the middle box on the right, showing the blue circle and the orange circle overlapping or connecting. Next slide, please. The connection between the policy for association and the policy on conversion application is also relevant in the sense that as you progress throughout the FSC system from pre-association, pre-certification through to association, and ultimately in an ending disassociation scenario, you have the application of the policy for association and policy on conversion at different points in time. What this chart is intended to lay out is where those connection pieces are and where associated organizations or certificate holders would need to comply with which policies and procedures at which time. In pre-association scenario, the entire normative framework would apply to the specific association or to the specific certification process. And so you have the policy for association and policy and conversion applying, and then the remedy procedures respectively for issues that were discovered in a pre-association or pre-certification stage. During association with FSC, the policy for association and respectively the policy on conversion continues to apply. In an ending disassociation scenario, the remediation process for ending that disassociation would be managed through the policy for association remediation framework, as this disassociation is connected to a policy for association violation. And the role of the conversion policy, as you will see in public consultation, is still being ironed out, where the conversion remedy procedure would come in to address a legacy of conversion in an ending disassociation scenario. We've identified a series of questions in public consultation in which you can answer to really provide your feedback and direction on this important point. Next slide, please. And finally, the key areas or the key messages that we have tried to bring into the remediation framework is the principle of continuous learning and co-creation, as articulated by the Global Strategic Plan. The demonstration of progress through transparent reporting, through what we call the remediation demonstration of progress website, which is operated by FSC. The introduction of peer review bodies to review methodologies to ensure robustness and use of best science and practice. The strong and meaningful engagement with rights holders and stakeholders, which is governed by the FSC FPIC guidance. The supporting and an emphasis on restorative practices in order to bring lasting resolution to conflicts and to remedy processes. And finally, that these principles or these outcomes are long-lasting, outcome-oriented, and verifiable and measurable. As we finish the overview presentation, I wanted to provide you an idea of what the process and timelines looks like. We will cover this at the end of the session as well, again, just as a reminder. Currently, we're in the public consultation period, which is open until the 21st of August. We will then move into the stakeholder feedback and review session in October. We will be working together with the conversion remedy procedure to align comments, to also ensure that we are connecting the dots between those processes. We will enter a second drafting phase at the end of this year. We will update the board in November of this year with where we've got to, what the public consultation results were, and what our revision process will look like. We will then move into a second public consultation, January through March, and ultimately complete the revision process and present the remediation framework to the International Board of Directors in June of 2022. Next slide. There are lots of opportunities for stakeholder engagement through informational webinars such as these for the remediation framework, also for the conversion remedy procedure, which are ongoing. And we're right at the end of the public consultation period for the policy for associations. So that public consultation is still open, and we welcome your feedback in that public consultation until the 17th of July. We will also be holding another webinar, a technical webinar this Friday. If you're interested in that, please visit the processes page under PFA Remediation Framework on the FSC website, and you can sign up for that webinar as well. Thank you very much. I'd like to hand it over to Loa.
This is where it's good if the moderator unmutes herself. Thank you, Salem. One question first from me, which I think maybe others would have. What's in the technical webinar?
In the technical webinar, we're going to take a deep dive into the indicators that are in the remediation framework.
Okay, thank you. So if you're more interested in getting nerdy about what the indicators actually have, that's the place to go. I don't have any hands raised right now. I have one question in the chat. So just a reminder, if you want to ask a question for the content of the particular presentation that Selim just did, please just raise your hand and you will be allowed to unmute yourself. And while we see whether anyone has any questions, we have one specific question from Sergio, which was one I actually wondered as well during your presentation. He says he's curious about what happens with this whole inclusions of supply chains in a reassociation process. So if you have a company A that's been disassociated, they have a supplier who's responsible for extensive deforestation. What then happens if that supplier refuses to implement a required remediation measures? Would that impact company A, disassociated company, so that they can't get reassociated? Must this company A take responsibility for the actions done by one of their suppliers? Or could company A just shift suppliers and then get reassociated?
I think that's a great question, and there's actually two questions in the public consultation, specifically directed towards the inclusion of the supply chain. And the guidance in the remediation framework lays out that the organization seeking ending disassociation with FSC is ultimately responsible. They're ultimately responsible for the remedy processes and for managing the remedy process through their supply chain. That would include ensuring that procurement contracts include FPIC guidance as the way of managing stakeholder and rights holder relations, for example. It would also include management of grievance mechanisms and complaints through the grievance mechanisms according to the UN guiding principles. Ultimately, if an organization that has been supplying to a disassociated organization and is responsible for significant deforestation, the company seeking ending disassociation is ultimately responsible for driving that remedy, and they would be responsible according to their supply chain to ensure that remedy for that environmental or social harm is then ultimately attained, whether that's through the company, whether that's through then their own management of their remedy process. That's the proposal. Okay. That's the proposal in the remediation framework.
Okay, so right now we're saying option C, where you can just shift suppliers and then you're out of your problem. That's not on the table, is our suggestion for now.
That's not on the table.
Good, thank you. Amparo, I'm just gonna ask you whether you can share the link to the sign up page for the technical webinar in the chat. Good, and then we have another question. Do we know how long the minimum maximum roadmap for a company to end disassociation would be? You had an indicator of 5 years, but is that the minimum maximum, or could you take longer or shorter time?
That's our estimation for the generic process. Mm-hmm. That within 5 years the company should be able to make significant progress against the thresholds that have been established in their company specific roadmap.
Okay.
Now, that's not a hard stop. There could also be a case in which the scope of the remedy and the scope of the thresholds that are included in the company specific roadmap would not be attainable within a 5-year period. And so we could imagine that you could expand that period to a longer one in order to adjust for larger processes. But ultimately, the idea of having this time frame there is to continue to keep organizations motivated to deliver on milestones, but it's not there to put pressure on processes, especially not pressure on processes with stakeholders and rights holders in order to come to agreements. That's counterproductive and actually could create more harm than good. So it's not there to put pressure on processes, but it's there to keep the parties motivated.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And actually, it's I just did a podcast interview with Pamela Peru, who has been part of doing the FPIC guidance. And one of her key messages was time is of the essence. There needs to be allowed time and not a time limit. So I welcome that. I have Phil who says hand. Phil, and maybe this is just an instruction for everyone. You can also just raise your hand. If you go under reactions in the bottom of your screen, you will see a raise hands function. But Phil, let me just find you and unmute you so you can ask your question. There you go.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Thanks. The issue of how you measure forest conversion, i.e. calculate the liability of violation of the PFA, has came up in one of the cases on OLAM that's currently proceeding. Currently, the FSC, although the FSC has had a long-standing definition of what is classified as natural forest, there is no agreed methodology on how you measure it. So I'm wondering if there is anything that has been advanced for this consultation, because I think it's kind of a sticky wicket, you might say. In the ERLAM, I think I'd say this is that, it was agreed that basically to at least benchmark against the high carbon stock approach, which has been developed by Greenpeace, the Forest Trust, and GARB, one of the palm oil companies, and it's sort of now been sort of mostly agreed by lots of companies, including APP on this call and various other things. But rather than sort of get into the weeds on the technical discussion, I wonder if there's something can be advanced on that by the FSC, because otherwise you get all the way down the line, you agree the processes and procedures, and then there's still a debate over how you make the calculation of what the liability is. Doing it on a case-by-case basis is not very efficient.
That's a great question, Phil. Thanks for that. It's actually a good segue to our next presentation around the requirements within the remediation framework. But let me just give you a quick teaser, Phil. Because the remediation framework is based on principles of continuous learning, we would hope within FSC to actually gain additional knowledge, experience in application of these methodologies. We've also, in the remediation framework, you will see in the guidance, we've also benchmarked this against high carbon stock approach, as well as references to the HCBRN, and other industry kind of standards for doing GIS analysis. But I would say, I think your question will be covered in the next session of this webinar.
Thank you, Selim. And now we're seeing the audience starting to warm up, which is very lovely. So we have another question from Ari, who's saying, I'm wondering what were the reasons that FSC made distinctions between unacceptable activities versus harm? How will you conclude and verify that certain harms were caused by some past unacceptable activities? Would liability result from unacceptable actions itself rather than just from the possible impacts, which was be determined for first?
All right, that's a great question. Again, thank you for that. There's a within the requirements and indicators of the remediation framework, we have a process laid out for the identification and assessment of harm arising from unacceptable activities. And there's a process for this that ultimately evaluates the presence of harm, whether it's related to past or ongoing issues, and then a registry of harm, which is then reflected in the grievance mechanism held by the organization. So I'm happy to go into that, but I would say this is, again, a segue into the next section of this webinar.
Fantastic. I have two more questions, and then maybe we move into the next session where Anna will present more. But It's for the timelines, both of them actually. One is the framework retroactive? Is there any cutoff year for including the supply chain? Because it will be related to the company responsibilities. And also, what is the consequences within the 5-year period if there then is a new violation of the PSA found by the applicant? What would FSC then do? Would we then wait another 5 years for that to be fixed, or would it be ended immediately?
Those are great questions. Again, thank you for those. The first question in terms of the supply chain, determining there's a kind of process that has been proposed in the remediation framework. There's actually also a public consultation question that's geared exactly towards the identification of the supply chain and how we would approach identification of supply chain and supply chain partners within the scope of the remediation framework. So I would really encourage you to go to the publication consultation website and download those questions and take a look at that. There is a proposal there, and we're looking for feedback directly on this. In terms of the new policy for association violations, which would be, the way I understood it, would be occurring during a company-specific roadmap process. Mm-hmm. This would go through the policy for association complaints processing procedure. So this is 01009 for those of you familiar with the FSC normative framework. That would be processed through there. And if indeed there would be new violations of the policy for association to be found, that would be grounds for termination of the roadmap.
Okay, thank you. For those interested in registering for the technical webinar, we now have several times in the chat a direct link for registration. And then there is one final question, so and then I'm going to ask you before we transition, which is, does the ending of a disassociation, is that the same as the end of the roadmap? Are you automatically reassociated when the roadmap is implemented?
This is a great question. We will spend some time on this in the next session as well. Okay. The answer to that is no. Ending disassociation is not an automatic reassociation or recertification of an organization. Reassociation, again, requires commitment to the policy for association, signing the trademark license agreement with FSC, signing on to the FSC terms and conditions, which is a separate process than the company-specific roadmap and fulfilling those thresholds and milestones.
Okay.
Why are these separate? These are separate because the ending disassociation process is a formal process, which is actually, it requires the approval of the FSC. This requires a decision by FSC to end the disassociation with the company. The reassociation with FSC is a process that is governed by our third-party certification system and with a relationship with a conformance assessment body.
Okay, I'm just making a few notes of questions that we want to take on the end. Thank you, Salem. With this, I would like to transition to Anna to explain much more about what are then the next steps and the actual requirements.
Thanks, Loa. Hi, everybody. My name's Anna Jenkins. I'm an independent consultant working on forest issues. And I've been working on this process since 2017 in its various phases as it's transitioned from being a draft FSC APP roadmap through to generic roadmap. And now, excuse me, the remediation framework. So in this process, recent process, we have myself and my colleague Shizuka Yasui have worked on reframing and representing what we worked on before but in a different format that we hope is more logical and takes those who have to use a remediation framework through a step-by-step process. So those who've been familiar with those other roadmaps will recognize parts of this when they look at the full detail. But the way we're setting out now is new. So this will be new for everybody. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so there's 4 key documents. There's a high-level summary, which contains a foreword. So even if you're interested in getting into the weeds and the detail, then it's better to cover the high-level summary. To read the high-level summary as well, because that's where the foreword is that really brings you into the spirit and intention of this document. Then we have the main FSC Remediation Framework. This is the consultation draft, and this is with the full sections and detail with all the requirements, all the indicators. I'll be running through the contents of that in this presentation. We have guidance. Guidance is in a separate document, and we hope that makes it easy to use in terms of not overwhelming in that first full document. There is a lot of guidance because this is a complex issue. And that guidance, you can use the 2 documents alongside each other and they're cross-referenced. And then we have separate definitions document. Some of these definitions are still work in progress, and you'll see that. We note where that's the case. Some of the definitions overlap with the policy on conversion and the conversion remedy procedure, and those are aligned. Next slide, please. Okay, so we see the process for the remedy of harm, that's both social and environmental harm, as a restorative continuum. So these are the stages that all cases will need to go through. So at the bottom of this diagram, you'll see there's a green case-focused line, and then below that, there's a company-focused grey line. So one would be at kind of systems level for each case, and below is looking a little bit more specifically. So the first step is acknowledgement, and this is prior to a roadmap. Now, no company can enter into a roadmap process unless they acknowledge the harm that has been done. So that's a prerequisite. And you will have seen that on Salem's diagram, where she shows the 5 years earlier on. So this is in the prerequisites. So before we start, we need that acknowledgement. Then we have the establishment phase. So in this phase, after a roadmap has been developed, then we need a company to ensure that it's establishing all the foundational infrastructure and systems it needs. This is what we call section U. It's U for universal. Then within that establishment process, and then moving on to actually specifically looking at remedy of harm, this company will need to identify rights holders, stakeholders, their rights and the harm done, and that will have to be very specifically identified. And there's a number of ways that that's done, and I'll get into that detail later in this presentation. Then we get into the process of dialogue. So the remedy process and agreements, we need to come up with remedy process agreements. So before we even start the process, the stakeholders and rights holders involved are going to need to be comfortable that this process is something they want to go through. So the first part of dialogue is the discussion about how are we going to get through this, how will we approach this, how will we resolve this. So we'll be looking at, as one of the first milestones is a remedy process agreement, and that can only be come to with proper dialogue. Then once the remedy process is agreed, then there will be dialogue to reach the actual remedy. So using the agreed process between the parties, then the parties discuss exactly what has happened, exactly what needs to be remedied, and exactly what would be acceptable as a remedy here. And again, that's whether or not it's social or environmental harm, this would go through the same steps. So that's the agreement phase. Once it's agreed, there will be formal remedy of harm agreements, which would set out precisely what needs to happen. Again, without pressure of time on these processes to reach that place of agreement. This can take a long time to come to that place of agreement. The remedy of harm agreements may have timed actions within them with milestones. That would be quite acceptable if that's acceptable to those parties involved. Once we have this remedy of harm agreement, we go into the remedy stage, and that's when remediation actions take place. Now, we can't say at this point when we're drafting a remediation framework precisely what all those remediation actions would be. That would be inappropriate, especially when it comes to social harm. There's more detail on environmental harm in the remediation framework, and I'll come to that later in this presentation. This red line that you see after the remedy stage, this is the ending disassociation phase. This line would mark, okay, can we end disassociation now? And how would we know whether we could end it? And that would be that the rights holders and stakeholders must be satisfied with progress of pilot cases. So a number of pilot cases would be identified. Those would be identified in the dialogue stage. So that's the blue stage, more or less in the middle of this diagram. So the pilots are there to test the processes, to test the remedy of harm agreements, and to test, you know, does this process work? So we would need to see, as FSC, we'd need to see that certain milestones were completed, these priority activities that will have been identified as part of that dialogue and agreement process. These would need to be completed before any ending of disassociation. But as we discussed in the Q&A earlier, the remediation framework, the company-specific roadmap does not end at the ending of disassociation. It would continue. So other activities that aren't priority activities would need to continue after the ending of disassociation. And continued association with FSC would be would require that those ongoing activities are completed. So once we're past the ending of disassociation, while those ongoing activities are happening, we're then in what we call the resilience stage. So this is where communication, relationship is building, there is ongoing remedy happening, that's being implemented properly, and trust is growing because that's being seen on the ground. Next slide, please. So this is what the remediation framework looks like. So on the left are orange sections, and these sections are compulsory sections in all cases. So the first is section U. These are the universal requirements. These are foundational infrastructure principles and procedures. We also have section T, which is trust building measures. And then we have section R, which is the general remedy of harm procedure. So within section U, we have the need for continuous improvement and learning environment and sufficient resourcing. We have remediation governance body. That's the body Salem's mentioned. It would be made up with rights holders and stakeholders. We have a grievance mechanism that must be established. There will be prevention of ongoing unacceptable activities, which are violations of the policy for association. Those must stop. There must be identification and respect of rights and rights holders. There must be, FPIC must be applied. Stakeholders, wider stakeholders than the rights holders must also be identified, and they must be engaged in the process, rights holders being a subset of stakeholders. We need human rights due diligence framework established, and we need environmental due diligence framework established. And there needs to be transparency and demonstration of progress. And that transparency and demonstration of progress occurs in every single section of the roadmap. So section T, trust building measures. This includes the mitigation of risks in wood and wood forest product supply chains. In effect, this is the application of controlled wood throughout the supply chain, but it's without any ability to make claims about controlled wood until after the ending of disassociation and until going through a controlled wood certification process. So there's no early claims about controlled wood, but it's used as an indicator to build trust between FSC and the companies in question, and to ensure that those risks are mitigated. So this trust building section also includes payment of fees, taxes, fines, and penalties, and anti-corruption measures as well. Section R, this remedy section includes rights and rights holders and stakeholder review. We need to check and check again. And then the identification of environmental and social harm, the remedy of harm process, and the identification of pilot cases. We have specific sections. These are the turquoise and yellow sections on the right-hand side in the lower part. These are additional detail, particularly for the environmental harm, where we have a whole process to go through to create landscape level conservation and restoration plans. There's also then would need to be site conservation and restoration plans leading on from that. The RS section, the remedy of harm in social harm cases, this is a shorter section, and it reminds the users all the steps that need to be gone through, so cross-referencing to other parts of the remediation framework that are in the orange section. Then there's a grey section in the top right. These are additional requirements relating to each of the different policy elements in the policy for association. So we have section A, B, C, D, E, and F. These correspond to the sections of the PFA, the policy for association. And some of these have additional guidance, additional requirements rather, and they all state which sections need to be followed if a case is registered for these specific policy elements. If those cases of violation occur, then you can use those sections to instruct you like a menu. Okay, what do I need to do in this case? Which parts of the remediation framework should I be using? Next slide, please. Okay, so this is looking at it from a different angle. So the lighter green line on the left is the start of an organization-specific roadmap, a company-specific roadmap. And then the more lime-colored green line to the right, between phase 4 and phase 5, that would be the verification point to end disassociation. And this shows you that all sections will proceed after the ending of disassociation. So the roadmap will not be finished until it's actually finished. The ending disassociation point is when trust is built to a strong enough strength that FSC can trust, yes, okay, we can see that good progress is happening here, so we can end disassociation. The work to remedy the harm and to maintain processes, systems, assurances, build trust, that continues after that ending disassociation point. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, here's another look. And what we're intending with this diagram is to show an iterative process. So this process, it is linear in that we go through the steps that we've seen in the different phases, the diagram that Salem showed. So we do go through steps 1 to 5. but we have to circle back and double check all the time. These cases are complex, harm is complex. Often those involved are not realized until perhaps further steps down the line. So in terms of identification of rights holders, identification of the harm and stakeholders, we need to revisit that all the time. So we start with, okay, this is who we think is involved. We map, record the harm. We have other processes to feed in any alerts of harm, all into a registry of harm. That's reviewed, specific processes are gone through, use of independent experts, and then we enter into the remedy of harm process in the centre. Then we go to pilot cases that remedy both social harm and environmental harm. These pilot cases may reveal new information, so we'll need to track back and check, have we got the right stakeholders here? Have we got the right rights holders here? Is there more harm here than we realized in the first place? So an iterative process. And we've just put as a reference at the bottom for the CRP, the conversion remedy procedure, the analogous sections of those of the CRP. Now this is a simplification, I should say, and we've just put it there just to track so that you can kind of track between the two procedures and see that there is an analogy there. Okay, so next section, please. Okay, so here's those sections again. Sections U, T, R, RS, and RE. So I'm going to go through them in a little bit more detail now. Next section, please. So here's the universal requirements. This is to establish foundational infrastructure, principles, and procedures that are needed in any company that is going to take responsibility for its impacts, and most importantly, to make sure that full risk assessments are done to stop impacts happening before they happen. So this includes governance and a grievance mechanism. Salem has mentioned that we have the remediation governance body, and this will be a governance body that is semi-independent of the company. Yes, there'll be company members on that governance body, but this governance body will be autonomous with rights holders and stakeholders as part of that governance body. This isn't stakeholder consultation group. This is an actual governance body that leads the process with the power to do that. The grievance mechanism is a crucial baseline mechanism that any company should have so that it can track what's happening with rights holders and stakeholders, and to spot harm early on and register that harm and then take action. That's just one way that harm is identified. This area also includes the identification and respect of rights holders, the application of FPIC and stakeholder engagement. We have the due diligence on human rights and environmental issues, and transparency in progress. Next slide, please. So I've covered most of that already. That's the numbering system which we're using. Next slide. There's a few more. Yes, so these are all the different numbers where we have the each of those different requirements covering one of those areas. Next slide, please. So in this slide, what we're seeing is all the different parts of these infrastructures, these core infrastructures, all what the company role is, what the stakeholder and rights holder role is, what the verifier will do, and what happens in terms of independent experts. So the company would define some of the terms of reference and provide some of the administration. There would be participation by rights holders and stakeholders, but participation as those within the governance body, which they will all have an equal governance role. And the verifier would assess when that's been established, and ensure it's been established sufficiently. Independent experts would also be invited to participate in that remediation governance body and be part of that. The grievance mechanism. So the grievance mechanism that would be managed and operated by the company, but it would need an independent governance overview body, and that may be the remediation governance body as above, or it could be separate. Stakeholders and rights holders role, well, the governance body, the remediation governance body would review and assess it every 2 years. And so rights holders and stakeholders fully can participate in that. Verifiers assess it, and the independent experts would peer review that to check that it's working properly. In terms of FPIC, the company must implement FPIC. The remediation governance body would review it, and rights holders would interact with that FPIC and hopefully benefit from it, and certainly be able to report back if that's not working. Obviously, FPIC agreements would need to be made with rights holders concerned that FPIC applies to. The verifier would assess. There would also be peer review. And independent experts aren't directly involved in this, but they would be more indirectly involved via the remediation governance body. There'll be identification of rights holders and stakeholders. Again, the company must implement it. The remediation governance body reviews that. There will be peer review and assessment. I should say that actually peer review involves independent experts. So while we've got none here under independent experts, it is actually peer review happening for FPIC and the identification of rights holders and stakeholders there. So due diligence framework. So due diligence framework in terms of human rights and environmental issues. There, again, it's for the company to implement. Again, the remediation governance body is reviewing that. Is this good enough? And that needs to be communicated to rights holders and stakeholders that that framework is in place and is operating. If it's not operating sufficiently from stakeholder and rights holder perspectives, then that's reason to go through a grievance mechanism process. It's assessed again by the verifier, it's peer reviewed and independently monitored in places. So the registry of harm, this is actually part of the remedy section, and arguably maybe should be in this infrastructure section. That's a point on which we're debating at the moment. So again, this is managed and operated by the company. The company must put all harm that it is aware of. This harm may be identified by the grievance mechanism. It may be identified by the due diligence framework. And it may also be identified by the specific actions that are required in section R, which I'll come to later. But all of these cases of harm must be brought together into a registry of harm, because that will be reviewed. And then that's how the company knows what needs to be remedied from that registry of harm. This registry of harm is reviewed by the remediation governance body, again assessed by the verifier, and it has annual peer review by independent experts to make sure that the right things are ending up in there and nothing's being missed. Then there needs to be transparency and progress. There needs to be a platform for that. The company can have its own platform, but FSC will also have its own platform. And that platform will only have information that has been fully verified. And the FSC platform will be the definitive place where progress through the roadmap process is communicated and defined. So again, this system will be overseen, implemented company's own website would be implemented by the company. And then the company has a responsibility to send things directly to the independent verifier, who will then verify items and publish them on behalf of FSC. Rights holders and stakeholders will have access to this information. That's the point of these platforms. And independent experts as well will have access to information. So next slide, please. So these are the trust building measures covering mitigation of risks across forest product supply chains, anti-corruption measures, payment of all due taxes, fines, fees, and penalties. And again, transparency and progress. And next slide, please. These are the sections that you'll find those specific parts in. And we do have a stakeholder question on anti-corruption measures and about maybe going a little bit wider. So if this is an area of interest to you, please have a look at the specialist stakeholder questions. Next slide, please. So this is on 2.1, which is the where controlled wood would be applied. So in this process of the application of controlled wood to the suppliers, to the company in question, the wood suppliers, this needs to be, the controlled wood needs to be applied in a stepwise process. So how do we do that? First of all, the company will need to identify first priority suppliers, second priority suppliers, and then all other suppliers. So as the labels indicate, the first priority are the highest priority to cover first. So this will be the highest risk suppliers. Those need to be covered off very early on. Second priority suppliers, yes, perhaps a little bit less risk, and the lowest risk will be in the all other suppliers. You can see at the bottom a mustard colored yellowy arrow. So this is the FSC standard 40005 part of controlled wood. This is the process part. This has to be applied right from the start in all company, to the company group, to all its facilities. So that's the process is ready to receive controlled wood, ensure that controlled wood is sorted, non-controlled wood kept separate from controlled wood. So then these first priority suppliers are going to need to get be compliant with the controlled wood standard for forest management. That's 30010. And this will need to happen before ending disassociation. The second priority suppliers, that can come in a little bit later. It can be after ending dissociation, but it will have to come in on a structured plan. And then all other suppliers by the end of milestone 2, which is after the ending of disassociation, that's all suppliers would then need to be compliant so that all supply is controlled wood and equivalent. And in this diagram, the grey area you see is once there is controlled wood compliance, once there is supplied wood, then we can see an increasing grey area growing so that all wood is controlled. Just a note for those who've been involved in earlier processes, this is exactly as we've agreed for the APP draft roadmap and generic roadmap. So this hasn't changed, it's the same. So next slide, please. So this is section R, for the instructions for the general instructions for the remedy of harm. So this involves the identification and prioritization of environmental and social harm. It involves remedy of harm procedures and processes and dialogue. It involves the pilot cases so that we can test that remedy of harm actually works. And again, transparency and progress. Next slide, please. So these are the different sections. The first two are a track back to section U. So just double checking, have we got the right rights holders in the room? Have we got the right stakeholders? Are we engaging with the right stakeholders? So that's that iterative process circle. In terms of the identification of environmental and social harm, there are very specific steps, as well as the processes that are covered in section U. There are specific steps in terms of mapping harm that are set out in section 3.3. This is also where we find the registry of harm. Then we have to develop procedures to remedy harm. So that there are requirements as to what needs to be in those procedures, but then it will be for the stakeholders, the rights holders, working with the company, for the remediation governance body as well, to ensure that the right procedures are in place. Because these will need to be different in different cultural settings. And then we set out indicators for the pilot cases. Okay, so sorry as well, transparency and demonstration of progress becomes quite repetitive, this, but it's so important that we are transparent all the way through and that we do ensure that progress is demonstrated. Next slide, please. So then we have a section for the remedy of social harm. Next slide, please. And also remedy for environmental harm. So the social harm is really just a reminder of all the steps that need to be covered, because all the detail is already set out in sections U and R in particular. When it comes to environmental harm, then there is more of a formula, and this is to your question, Phil. So there is the need to develop a landscape level conservation and restoration plan. And this needs to be proportionate to the harm that has occurred. So the conservation and restoration areas need to be one-to-one proportionate. These need to be areas that are proximate to where the harm occurred. So need to be as close as possible. And there also needs to be like for like. So we can't have certain high conservation values that have been destroyed being remedied or via conservation or restoration of a completely different habitat type. That wouldn't work. It has to be the same kind of habitat, same kind of value. Otherwise, that would not be proportionate, and that wouldn't be right, and it wouldn't be proper remedy. So the detail is set out there, and then these would be tested through pilot plans at site level. And these pilot plans would have to have the priority activities, would have to be met prior to ending disassociation. So next slide, please. So these are the requirements specifically, and their numbering. You will have access to this, so it will provide you with an overview. And next slide, please. So we haven't gone into the detail of sections A to F. We can do that in the technical webinars, but now we can go back to Loa for questions.
Thank you, Anna. And I was noting down questions while you were talking here in the end. I have a lot of questions, and I do have some anonymous ones. So Grant, I see your hand. I will allow you to speak in a minute, but I'll just tackle some of the first ones that came in, and they are actually all focused on the involvement of stakeholders and what defines a meaningful involvement of stakeholders. So first of all, I'd like to just remind everyone that we cannot talk about specific cases or ongoing cases. This has to be a discussion on the framework as such. I know it's very tempting to compare to cases that's going on and processes in the past. We will have to lift ourselves above that and talk about how can we do this going forward. That said, Anna and Salim, how do we define meaningful consultation with stakeholders? How much stakeholder consultation is required as a prerequisite before developing a company roadmap?
Do you want me to take that? I think Salem may be better on the before company roadmap side, but perhaps if I start with what defines meaningful stakeholder consultation. Well, this is a case where we actually have to ask the stakeholders themselves. Stakeholder consultation is meaningful if the stakeholders themselves say, yes, this is meaningful, this is meeting our needs. So we can't say, we can give pointers, we can, within our requirements and indicators, what we're saying is you need to take note of certain factors that you need to make sure that the space is the correct space, that the timing of it is correct, that the right people are in the room. So we can give those kinds of, well, these are requirements, not guidance, but we are pointing to the ingredients of meaningful stakeholder engagement. But in the end, it's only meaningful if it's meaningful to those stakeholders. So the most important indicator is that which it requires asking the stakeholders, is this meaningful? Is this going well? And if they say, yes, it's good, it's going well, it's meaningful, then we have meaningful stakeholder consultation. So I'm sorry if that sounds a little bit of a roundabout answer, but these are not complete, hard and fast. These are absolutely rules that that always have to be followed, and this will bring out meaningful consultation because this is a back and forth between those. So our requirements are requiring that you are talking to them, that factors are taken into account. Like, it's very easy for stakeholder consultation to go wrong when it happens in the wrong place and the wrong time with not the right people in the room and is perhaps rushed and forced. And so everything we outline is trying to avoid that. In terms of prior to the remediation framework beginning, so actually setting out a stakeholder, a company-specific roadmap, then I'll pass over to Salem on that, because that process of actually developing the roadmap isn't covered within the remediation framework itself.
Okay, thank you. Before you do that, Anna, I'd just like to point your attention to the comment from Abdul, which is directly connected to what you were just talking about, where he suggests that the remediation governance body will have much stronger emphasis on dialogue process of learning and on co-creation as a risk mitigation as part of the process, and that we emphasize that even more. And Salem, then over to you. What's required?
So I just
prior?
say I really strongly agree with Abdul's comment, definitely.
Thanks, Loa. The process for the development of the company specific roadmap. So this is the roadmap which would lay out the specific remediation framework for a specific organization based on their policy for association, unacceptable activities, and the remediation of those. The process that we have in place or that we're proposing is that once the prerequisites for the remediation framework have been met by a specific organization, these are the prerequisites that are listed in the policy for association complaints processing procedure. These prerequisites would then start the drafting process. So once those prerequisites had been fulfilled, then the drafting of the company-specific roadmap would start, and that company-specific roadmap would go out to public consultation, and we would hold informational webinars and technical webinars to gain stakeholder feedback and input into that process. And then ultimately that finalized document would go to FSC decision for approval before implementation would begin. If you could go to the five line model at the beginning of my presentation to review that in more detail.
Okay, Grant, I will get to you in just 1 second, but this is actually directly related to the very first comment that I had, which I was planning to ask in the end session, but we have stakeholders out there that want impact now. They want remediation now. They don't want to wait 5 years. How do we deal with that?
Is that a question to me, Loa?
It's a general question. I don't know who it's for. It was the first question that I got even before, well, in Salem's presentation, basically. But the question is really, we've been waiting for so long for remediation of the harm done to us. We don't want to wait another 5 years. How are you going to deal with that?
For proper remedy to come about, it needs to be appropriate for the situation and to those who have that harm has been done to. And the only people who can say what is the correct remedy of harm are those who have had that harm done to them, and they will need to go through a process, and it may not take 5 years. We absolutely certainly hope that it wouldn't take 5 years. So that 5 years is not, it's there as a point to say, okay, at this point, let's have a review, let's have a check what's happening here. 5 years is probably about the amount of time that a full process and everything it involves can take. And it may take longer in some of these more complex cases. The pilot cases are an opportunity for the highest priority cases, some of the highest priority cases to be looked at. And those pilot cases can be very large cases. They could be a case involving just one person or a single household. We would encourage that a range of different size and scale specific cases within a company's operations are looked at, so that there's a wide range. So this isn't to say that it will absolutely take 5 years to remedy harm. There is a prioritization process involved. So obviously where there has been a lot of harm done, then it will take time to process some of these issues. The company will have to adjust capacity in terms of what it's facing. It will need to make good decisions in order, if it has a lot of harm, it can't just push cases of harm infinitely into the future. Obviously, there will need to be a balance in terms of progressing gradually in a learning fashion, but also coming to the urgent cases with a sense of urgency. And again, we would see the remediation governance body as having a very strong steer over what is the right, what's the right mix. So are we making sure that we're getting good remedy that actually is meaningful to those who've suffered harm and to stakeholders who are perhaps representing environmental harm issues, rather than trying to rush everything too fast and equally not going too slow. So it won't necessarily be 5 years, but it will take some time. Salem, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
No, I think you've covered that. I think you've covered that well.
Thank you. Grant, thank you for waiting so patiently. I will ask you to unmute and we'll see how it goes.
Hi, thanks, Laura. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
We can.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, there was a question above mine, but anyway, I'll shoot my ones now. I guess I had a comment just around the precondition and baseline stage. When I take your point, Anna, I mean, the process is really complex, but the way you describe meaningful consultation, I'm reassured by that. That hasn't been our experience so far in a number of processes. So we're hoping for a change in that. We haven't been listened to, we haven't had our concerns addressed and so forth. So I'm hoping for a change in that. But Our concern is that, yeah, at a precondition and baseline stage, there is outreach to stakeholders at that point, not just disclosure from the company. If you really want to find out what's going on, then you can't just expect disclosure from the companies. So I'm hoping that is included in there at a very early stage. And my second point, I guess, in the question is, for clarification, is if there are any failures at any of the stages, does that mean the process stops or pauses at least? And if so, what are the thresholds for each of those stages to progress? Because it seems like it needs to be really clear to see, how this needs to progress, and so things don't jump ahead. And yeah, if we're looking at the Corindo case, for example, I mean, it's looking like it's breaching a lot of those proposed processes in many ways, particularly around transparency. So yeah, I'm interested just to, yeah, particularly on those stages and what happens when there's failures. Thanks.
Thank you, Grant. I know it's really difficult not to go into specific cases. I have to remind again that this is not the objective of this webinar. We have to talk about this in a principled manner, which is very difficult. I know that it is. Anna and Salem, would you like to reply to Grant? What happens if things are breached as part of the process? Does it help?
Yeah, I can start. Thanks, Grant. Yeah, great questions there. So in terms of breaches, as you run through the draft, when you're looking at this draft of the full text, you'll see that there are some highlighted areas. These usually relate to number of months and years, and then those are in green, and then there's also some pink highlights which may relate, say, to number of pilot cases, etc. And those are to be determined in the specific organization-specific, company-specific roadmaps. So they would be defined as part of that process. But these would be the places when there is an actual timescale connected to it. And we're going to be moving these more to like milestone points. So these would be points, 2, 3, and up to point 4 on we call it the 5 lines map that Salem showed right at the beginning, which features the 5 years. So if these specific areas that are highlighted within the remediation framework or the company-specific roadmap aren't met at those milestones, then that will cause a stop, a pause. And I think Salem can maybe talk to some maybe more serious issues that could occur that could cause an actual full suspension. But ultimately, if the key milestones are not met at the right time, then there would either need to be a pause for a catch-up. So certainly there wouldn't be an ending to disassociation. And if it's something more serious, like, for example, a new PFA violation, this could lead to a much more serious suspension of the process. But I'll hand over to Salem to speak more on that. And also this precondition and baseline stage that you mentioned, and that the importance of the consultation not just being with companies at that early stage, that it needs to be stakeholder consultation. Again, that's the process of developing the roadmap rather than the contents of the remediation framework itself. So I'll hand over to Salem on that one.
Thanks, Anna. Regarding the failures, the definition of failures in the company-specific or organization-specific roadmap, I think the other aspect, in addition to what Anna has mentioned, which I support, that I would also say that there's also, through the verification of the milestones, there's also an accreditation process for the accreditation of those third-party verifiers, as well as the operational guidance for issuing corrective actions against those milestones. So I think that's another aspect to bring into that discussion. In terms of stakeholder involvement in the pre-association, pre-certification phase, Grant, I take this. I'll take this on. This is actually part of this intersection, if you will, between the conversion remedy procedure and the policy for association remediation framework. There is stakeholder consultation aspects in the company-specific roadmap process, which is not part of the conversion remedy procedure. So that's feedback for us to take back as FSC to try to bring those pieces closer together.
Thank you. Just a point of check so people know where we're at. I have 2 questions from Ida. Then we'll go to Ari, who also has her or his hand up, I don't know. Then I have a question from Darwin, and then I have a question from Hoa, just so you know where you are in the line. We are also cutting parts of the presentation, and it's about the next steps, or at least slimming them down quite dramatically, so we have more time for this Q&A, which is what's most important for you guys. So first, question from Ida. Who will pay for all of this?
Maybe I can answer that. So the actual operation of the company's specific roadmap or the organization's specific roadmap would be supported by the company seeking to remedy the policy for association violations. There are aspects of the verification and reporting which FSC would be responsible for, and this would be covered by FSC, but we would seek to balance the cost of operating or operationalizing the remediation framework through dispute resolution cases. So that's a short overview of how we would cover costs and who would be responsible for paying what.
Okay, but primarily the company.
Yes.
Good. Second question, also from Ida. How will we deal with with temporary one-time suppliers that are very popular at the moment in these cases?
These would be, if I understand Ida's question correctly, these would be one-off suppliers or smallholders that would be part of the company supply chain, but for a very limited period of time, not on a long-term basis. This is a good question. Determining who these suppliers are, the volumes of supply for a given time period, and really ascertaining the nexus of that supply to the company is actually quite a difficult task. We have a proposal in the remediation framework that we're actually asking stakeholder feedback on to provide further insight, further information on how we would go about ascertaining this list of suppliers. But I think what Ida is pointing to is that this is quite a difficult task or difficult expectation that we've laid out.
Mm-hmm. Good. Ari, finally it's your turn. You've been waiting very patiently as well. I will ask you to unmute. And you should be able to speak out now.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Sorry. Thank you, Laura.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, just thank you very much, Anna, for presenting the slides to us. I just want to get back actually to my previous question. You know, what would be, you know, what is actually the the original intention, regard, in relation to the necessity and also practicality aspect of referring to harms instead of the actual wrongdoings, right? The actual unacceptable activities / actions. And to what extent this actually, that we are going to kind of define, the extent of magnitude and severity of the harms caused, because depending on the scale, how we actually see the harms, then definitely, the implication will be different, right? So if we see at the regional level, for example, if I think there was also a question on this in relation to, let's say, a decline of RT species population in a region is tied to a certain, action by a single company, while there are like 100 other companies in the region, right? So I can see, that if we just focus, for example, on the extent of the wrongdoings, this is going to be quite straightforward, right? So I mean that if you clear like 10,000 hectares, for example, then you are liable for that particular actions, right? But once we go into estimating harm, then this is like feeling like opening a can of worms, right? Because we can, depending how you want to, expand your scope, at the regional level or at the global level, to say that this clearing can cause, like, has caused climate change, for example. So how do we, manage this kind of situation? Because we are going towards this direction in trying to remedy the harm rather than the wrongdoings. Thanks.
Sorry, I needed to unmute. Thanks, Ari. Ari, you're coming specifically from a high conservation value perspective here, or less specifically an environmental perspective? When you're concerned about harms, is it the social harm that you're particularly concerned about, or are you meaning just environmental harm in general that you're concerned? Just trying to route where your question's coming from so I can answer it well. Sorry, Ari, I was asking you a question back just for some clarification.
Sorry, thanks. Sorry, no worries. I was trying to unmute myself.
Yeah, sorry, I had to.
I present like an example, like for example, from the perspective of decline of certain RT species in relation to ACV1 or ACV2, for example, right? But it doesn't mean that it doesn't apply as well to like social context, because once, it may be, let's say, more practical if we go back into a certain date and we estimate only the extent of the violation of certain, rights of indigenous people, right? While over, in the next 50 years, let's say, this, if we go into the direction of harms, then obviously probably these people whose harm has been violated in the past will no, I mean, their descendant will no longer have the same perception, right, of the of the harms caused, right? So harms is like a little bit more dynamic in a way that it depends on, let's say, also the dynamic of the society, the like newer research, for example, that certain action can cause certain harms that can add up over time, right? And as being said also that there are like other factors like neighboring companies that may also cause this harm, right? Well, the extent of the wrongdoing itself is very specific to certain companies, right? So I was trying to kind of get the the original idea why we actually expand this to harms, which is more like, you know, it is more complex to estimate, right? Because that has, you know, harms has a lot of factors to consider, and often they are not the result of the wrongdoing of one single companies, right? So, and, you know, thanks.
Yes, thank you. Oh, hang on. Yes, I am unmuted. Sorry, I'm just double checking. Thanks very much, Ari. You're actually highlighting precisely, you know, some of the great nuance that those rights holders and stakeholders and companies involved will need to get into this detail, because harm is nuanced. We're focusing on and using the term harm because of the UN guiding principles. And it's very important. I don't think we can turn back from harm now. It's here, recognized in our society, that there are serious impacts from forestry and other companies working in natural resources. And we do need to face that, and it is nuanced and it is difficult. And I agree, and it will take some time to work through. And in terms of actual environmental harm, because it is a little bit more specific and a bit more predictable. And you were saying that the wrongdoing is specific and it's easier to focus on that. And that's true. And of course, a similar wrongdoing in different environments could lead to different harm and ramification. So if we compare a temperate and a tropical environment, for example, and different forest types, then the same action in those different forests could have very different ramifications in different places. So some landscapes are a bit more resilient, but might not cause so much harm in one, but in another it could be catastrophic, the very same action. So what I think I can say is that in section RE, which is the remedy for environmental harm, then we do have very specific requirements, indicators. So I've mentioned before that areas have to be proportionate, that we have to look at natural forests converted, we have to look at HCBs destroyed, illegal logging. We have to look at that mapping and inventory data that we collected in section R. So we have to look at exactly what has happened where, and then look for proportionate areas. So I think that's a little bit easier to do in terms of harm. We call it all harm because it is all harm, to use the same terminology, but it gets a little bit more specific and less nuanced within the detail of section RE. I hope that's okay, but I think maybe we could go into more detail in the technical webinars on Friday, and on, I think it's the 22nd is the other one.
Good. I think that would be good because we have another 6 minutes. I have another 3 questions and we would like to do wrap up as well. So I'm hoping that the next couple of questions can be a bit short so that we don't run too much over. But I'd also like to warn that we are probably likely to run 2-3 minutes over. First one is from Dharmawan, who's also been waiting very patiently, whose question is on landscape level restoration. And the comment is that if we are going into landscape level restoration, we are bound to run into issues related to rights of management. And how will we deal with that?
Okay, so thanks for the question. I'm just reading it in the Zoom chat. Thanks, Dharmawan. So we'll likely come into face issues of management right or management authorities within the landscape. Well, the landscape level plan, it will need to be a landscape level plan, and also a landscape level within the context of the company itself. So certainly when these plans are developed, it will absolutely have to be developed in consultation with neighbours. If the landscape involves neighbours right in the middle of the same landscape, then absolutely those neighbours are then very key stakeholders, and the company would need to have to work with them. And so obviously, if there is a situation where one landowner is completely refusing to want to participate, then the company would have to deal with that situation. And certainly FSC would not be able to insist that someone who isn't actually an involved party in the disassociation has to do anything. Of course not. But this is about making appropriate full wide-scale plans at the first step, and then making site plans at the second step. So I think maybe the term is perhaps a little bit confusing, because obviously within forestry, the term landscape level plan is used for kind of a very meta scale, a very large scale. And what we mean here is the fullest scale for that company group.
Okay, so maybe a definition needed there. A bit more of a specific yes or no kind of a question, perhaps, from Hoa. Can agroforestry models be part of a restoration plan?
That's a good question. I would say that you know, if it's an appropriate thing in that area, and if it's what has been destroyed has come from that kind of a land use, then yes, potentially. But again, to say that, you know, we do need to have equivalence, and that equivalence would need to be equivalent to what has been destroyed. It may be that agroforestry projects are a different kind of remedy for perhaps social harm, and that would be you know, fully appropriate. But I think, again, this would be a case-by-case basis, but we would need to keep these principles of proportionate, equivalent, and proximate. And then we also have additionality and longevity there as well. So we would need to make sure it met those. Again, that's
Okay.
all in RE.
And Grant is commenting on that as well. The last question, which is one of the anonymous ones and a bit of a difficult one. What is FSC's advice for supporters? And I asked, what do you mean by supporters? It's general users, people who would like to buy FSC certified products. So this can both be for consumers or just supporters of FSC, or for companies. What is your advice for your supporters when they are invited to do business with a company who has records of policy of association cases?
I think that's a question for Salem. Sorry, Salem, asking a hard one. No, that's fine. I mean, we get these questions every once in a while from consumers or from buyers. They're interested to understand, you know, where certain organizations are in their association with FSC, and our response is that you know, a company that is that has been disassociated from FSC does not have the permission to use the FSC trademarks to trade an FSC certified product, to label end products, to put products into the market using the FSC label. And of course, we would support organizations in prioritizing procurement of FSC certified products. In terms of organizations which are working to end disassociation with FSC, those organizations would not be able to put labeled product into the market until only after achieving the ending disassociation threshold with FSC and embarking on an FSC certification process, at which stage they would be associated with FSC and able to put labeled goods into the marketplace. And so from that perspective, I would say that we would again support organizations in procuring FSC certified products, but but of course also doing what they can to incentivize organizations that are embarking on remediation processes to continue to work with them, continue to support them in their remediation process so that they can ultimately get certified again.
Thank you. So once certified, we will start supporting purchase again.
Yeah.
Good. That we actually ran out of time. I never got to go to my hard questions, Selim. I'll let you conclude in a second, but first I have a bit of a challenge for you. Would you be up for me interviewing you for a podcast with all the difficult questions that I have, because we didn't even cover those, so that we can actually get those covered as well?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. You're catching me a bit off guard, but I think it's a good idea. I think it would be welcomed as well. And we could record that and make that available. That's a good idea.
Fantastic. And I will make sure that everyone who signed up for today will get a direct link once we have that done. Selim, I will hand over to you for a wrap up conclusions and very rapid next steps.
Yeah, thank you. So I just wanted to remind you again, we will be hosting 2 additional webinars. We will have a repeat of this informational webinar later today from 4 to 6 p.m. CEST time zone. But we will also be hosting 2 technical webinars. And in addition to that, it sounds like a podcast. The technical webinars will take place on the 2nd of July, so this Friday, starting at 12 CEST. That technical webinar will be 2.5 hours long. We will also record it and make it available. The second technical webinar will be on the 22nd of July. We're planning to cover different content based on stakeholder feedback and questions that we receive that we were not able to get into the level of detail in these informational webinars. So we invite you to register for those and to attend those 2 technical webinars. I would also like to remind you that the Policy for Association public consultation on the actual policy is still ongoing until the 17th of July. You still have a few more days to get your comments in. And of course, it's related to this framework and to the scope of this framework. So please take some time to get to know the revised Policy for Association public consultation. And finally, the conversion remedy procedure is also out for public consultation, and this will be going until the middle of August, excuse me. And again, because of these interrelated remediation processes, your feedback is welcome there as well. I would like to close here. I hope you've enjoyed the webinar. And of course, if you have any further questions or would like to reach out to us to answer any particular questions in a technical webinar or maybe in a podcast, please feel free to contact myself, Amparo Ariano, or Loa with your questions, and we will make sure that you get some responses. Thank you very much.
And before we end and everyone leaves, we have just one final small poll that we really love for you to answer, so that we know whether we captured the information needs that you actually have, so that we can adjust for the next session. So please, if you can, just ask us or answer us these 2. The first one is, which describes best your level of understanding now that you've been part of this webinar? Do you understand it? Have you gained useful information, or did you not get the information that you were looking for? And how do you now feel about this whole remediation framework? Do you agree? Do you agree somewhat? Are you indifferent? Do you disagree? Or do you just don't know yet? If you could answer those 2 questions, I see that we already have almost half of the participants answer those questions. I'll just give it a minute more because they are long questions to digest. And it's moving up rapidly. And we are almost at the level where everybody answered. I think, Amparo, that we can end the poll now and show people the results. So the good news is that 77% of you have gained useful information. The downside is you need more information, which we understand. We therefore strongly encourage you to join the technical webinars. We will make sure we share this recording. We will make sure that we give as much information that we can. Your opinion, I'm very glad to report that we have very strong support for the remediation framework and the purpose and the process suggested. So thank you very much for that. We hardly have anybody disagreeing with it. We do have some that don't know, which is also understandable. This was the first session, and we will try to keep engaging with you and getting your level of knowledge up so you can form an opinion. Thank you very much for participating today. And we hope to see you at the technical webinars. And we hope to see a lot of your comments in the consultation. Thank you all.
Thank you, Loa.
Thanks.
Thank you.